Hello, I'm Charlotte Leisman. Welcome to the Gothic Literary Society. Today we're talking about vampires, one of my favorite tropes out there. Vampires have been around for hundreds of years. They go in and out of style, and I think there's a really good reason for that. I think vampires symbolize so many things in the Gothic sphere that they will always resonate with people in so many different ways. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So, first of all, my first experience with vampires was back in 1987 when I saw the movie The Lost Boys. That was my first movie obsession, so much so that I went to church camp and told them that I wanted to be a vampire, which did not go over very well. But I think you can understand that there's something about vampires that just speaks to so many different people in so many different ways. So we're going to look at a couple examples. So keep in mind, if you've seen my video, What is Gothic Lit? We talked about Gothic themes, and we talked about them being something that people refer to as the irrational, meaning that Gothic themes are those that can't be reasoned. The Gothic themes are very often those that deal with psychological and spiritual issues that are not particularly tangible or sometimes a little harder to get our hands around. If you haven't seen the video, I'll leave a link above. Otherwise, let's get into it. So the first example today that I'd like to talk about is Dracula by Bram Stoker. And there are a number of different themes that people put forth when they talk about what perhaps Stoker meant. And one of them is that Dracula was meant to be about erotic fear. I tend to dismiss that one, at least in his case, for a couple different reasons. First of all, it's a very modern interpretation, and whenever people in the modern era put a modern interpretation on a historical context, I tend to look for more evidence, and that's the second reason why I tend to dismiss that one in this case. Is I really don't see a lot of evidence for that in the book. I mean, you could maybe argue that Mina was a bit prudish, but honestly, she was fairly consistent with the other characters from other writers in that era, so I don't see a whole lot of support for that one. Another possible explanation for what Stoker meant to put forth is that Dracula was meant to symbolize the Western European, in particular the British, fear of immigrants coming in from Eastern Europe. I find a lot more support for that one. So let's take a look at that just briefly. So first of all, he sets it up so that Dracula cannot rest apart from his native soil. None of the vampires can. So he has to bring the coffins full of dirt from his native country of Romania to England. So that could easily symbolize a whole lot of things. When at first reading, it seems odd that you would bring coffins full of dirt and you couldn't just sprinkle a little bit of dirt in the coffin and sleep on it. The fact that he has to bring so much implies that perhaps the author meant something distinct from that, and I think it's very likely meant to indicate that there was a fear of Eastern Europeans bringing their native soil, meaning symbolically their native culture and their ways, to England, and perhaps that would alter the English culture. It always does. I mean, over time, if you look at any historical period and any culture, as people move in and out and other cultures mingle with that culture, the culture invariably alters. It changes, it shifts, it merges with the other cultures around it. And that was something potentially that the people at that time were afraid of, like people have been since the beginning of man. A second example is that when Dracula moves to England, the first thing he does is begin to feed off of English people. Obviously, he can't survive without drinking blood. That very clearly suggests a fear, and it does so in the reader as well, as if there is some external entity coming into England and threatening its people and potentially destroying them. So that could very easily play into the same theme. And to add to that, and I will make that maybe a third point, the victims Dracula chooses are the women. So he's not particularly going after the men, he's really going after the women. And women are often symbolically linked in writing and other forms of media to a nationalism. And if you look at the book of that Bram Stoker wrote, you'll see that there's this group of strong young British men who have to come along and through their valiant efforts save the women and the culture from these external forces. And of course, it's not without loss. They lose the life of one of their own in the process, but the implication and what you come away with as a reader is that there was this external threat to the nation, and it was only the men of the nation rising up to defend the women or the culture symbolically that kept that external threat at bay. So I think that's very likely what Stoker intended, but regardless of what he may or may not have meant, I think what you can see from that illustration is that vampires and the use of vampires can mean something so profound that the trope itself is not really just about some bloodthirsty bloodlust. And that's the key in Gothic writing. So in writing in which everything means something deeper, your tropes need to be very closely aligned with your theme. And that's exactly what we see in that example. And we're going to look at another one, a more contemporary one as well. So my second example is Anne Rice's book, The Interview with the Vampire. In The Interview with the Vampire, this is Anne Rice's first book in the Vampire Chronicles. So the book starts off with a character by the name of Louis. And Louis is who we're going to focus on today. So there's a lot that goes on in the book with Claudia as well, and Lestat, who we learn a lot more about him in subsequent books. But let's talk about Louis. So one of the things that's particularly interesting with Louis is that in a lot of other vampire books or movies, what you see are a whole lot of characters who actually covet the idea of eternal life and this power that comes with being a vampire, which is not really the case with Louis. Louis actually wants to die before he is transformed into a vampire. The movie is relatively consistent with this, and I like the movie, but you really need to read the book to understand the nuances of that, because the book just delves into that so much more deeply than the movie does. What you really see when you look at Louis is a man who was at a point of despairing. There were some significant things going wrong in his life before he became a vampire, and then he was transformed into a vampire. I'll try not to give away too much. And he spends the rest of the book in a very existential debate about his soul. So there's a lot that goes on in the book. It's not a boring read. So if that sounds a little too philosophical for you, don't give up. Give it a try. It is actually a plot-driven book as well. However, he spends a lot of time questioning whether he, now that he's trapped in the form of a vampire, because he has to feed off of people in theory to survive, for a while he tries to feed only off animals and get around this. But now that he's stuck in this form, is he truly evil? Is he good? Does he belong to God? Does he belong to Satan? And then at the end of the book, or towards the end, he begins to question the existence of God. So then, of course, that leads him to question how he can find meaning in life if the world is truly a godless world. So he goes on this very philosophical and spiritual journey throughout the book, while there is a strong plot going on as well. So all that to say, regardless of what you think about Louis' journey, you can see that by using a creature that is stuck in an perpetual and eternal night, literally and figuratively, Anne Rice has opened the door to be able to explore those kinds of themes, those kinds of spiritual themes, because this character's identity is so closely aligned with the things she is trying to ask. So that is a little bit of a precursor to what we're going to talk about next. So third and lastly, I would perhaps say, so then where could you go with vampires? And the answer is a lot of different places, of course, but you're going to want to stick to themes. So think about, just like we just talked about with Louis, think about vampires with respect to their identity and how their identity could be a model for something that's going on thematically in the book. So, for example, a lot of people use vampires to talk about a lust issue. Now, it doesn't have to be an erotic lust. It could be an addiction. I'm not sure I know of an example of that out there today, but that would be a really good use for vampires. So vampires have this need for blood that's stronger even than the human need for food. And you could use that very easily to parallel someone who is unable to escape the bonds of a particular addiction. That would be particularly useful. Or you could use a vampire for any number of romantic themes. That has been done, of course, because that's an easier leap to make. So, an insatiable love, you could use it for a very unhealthy insatiable love. So, say your characters have a need to dominate and overpower people. Maybe they have some inability to love in a healthy way. Well, a vampire is often going to be useful in that type of scenario to explore that kind of theme, because a vampire, just by virtue of his desire for power or his ability to take power more easily, or it could be a woman, doesn't have to be a man, that person could very easily take that to an extent that is unhealthy. So you could use it in that setting. We've seen settings such as, like in Twilight, Stephenie Meyer used vampires to represent people who are outsiders. Vampires are, for obvious reasons, outsiders from mainstream culture. And in that book, she sets up a community of vampires in which those who feel like outsiders find a place to belong. So that parallels the vampires really well as well. So all that to say, find your theme, and if you can find a way to use vampires to illustrate your theme more readily, just by virtue of the vampire's identity and the fact that they have to drink blood to survive, or the fact that they are naturally more inclined to exert power over other people, find a way to marry that identity with your theme, and you're going to have a vastly more powerful and resonant book. And that is exactly what I hope you do. And I hope a lot of people out there will continue to do so, because I love vampires. I love vampire books and vampire movies, but they have to be done well for them to really, really speak to people. So let's go out there and write a whole lot of really great vampire books. That's it for today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Ring that bell and hit the subscribe button to be notified whenever I release new videos. I post a video every Friday. So until then, stay undead, my friend.